Alright, in this video we're taking a look at the CrazyBee F4 Lite. This is a 1S all-in-one flight controller board. I actually have talked about this a little bit in previous videos, and you can go back and take a look at those. I'll link those in the description. Got the Mobula 6. This is the board that's in there, and then I use this board also in my 1S baby tooth build. You can see right there. So this board is 1S only. This here is the retail version of the board. It is a replacement board specifically for those that want to replace it in their Mobula 6, although you can use these for other purposes, but I'll talk about that here in a little bit because I've been hearing some people running into issues. But this is the retail board. It comes with a little plug there that you can solder onto your camera. That goes into the little camera port right there, and then you get the so a few extra screws and for mounting, and also the rubber grommets that will go into the side holes here for mounting, and then you have a battery connector, and comes with the same solid pin connector that's on the Mobula 6. That's the one that people are preferring, and you can see here that all of the motor plugs are pre-soldered on. This is a pretty unique board. It is basically a truly all-in-one board. It has video transmitter, receiver, 4 ESCs, and flight controller, all in a pretty tight package here. Let me just go ahead and show you what the thing weighs. It's pretty, I think it's like 4 grams or something like that. So yeah, yep, just a little over 4 grams without the battery lead. Throw on the little battery connector, it's about 4.8 grams. Okay, so even though this comes with a built-in receiver and video transmitter, you can attach things to the other 2 UARTs that are available here, and they have some very, very tiny solder pads here, and here you can attach an external receiver, which I actually did on the baby tooth and soldered on a FreeSky XM receiver, so you have inverted R1 and regular R1 here for UR1, and then T1 here, 5 volts and ground there. And you do need a very fine tipped soldering iron and some very good soldering skills to get in here to solder to these pads without touching, for example, these plugs and melting them. If you don't have the right equipment, it is very difficult to do, if not impossible. And I've heard people complaining that it's too difficult to do these. Now, it is because this is a very tight board, and they've crammed in a video transmitter and receiver here as well, and kept the board very light. They're using a very thin PCB here as well. So when you're working on this board, you need the right temperature. You need to use flux, and you need to get in here very quick. And don't leave your soldering iron on the pads for too long, otherwise you're going to damage the board because it is so thin. There's nowhere for the heat to go, and then things will just start popping off. I have heard of the pads coming off, and then, like, for example, these little pads here for the wires for the battery lead have a tendency of coming off as well. And that's because you're probably applying too much heat or for too long, because this is a very thin board. There's nowhere for the heat to go, and those pads will just get lifted right off. So yeah, this is probably why they made this kind of all plug and play. So if you use this for its intended purpose as a replacement board for the Mobula 6, there is no soldering that needs to be done other than soldering the battery lead back on here. And that's probably the easiest job to do, because you basically, it's got through holes here, so you could probably get these on here pretty easily, and then just make sure you get that soldered on. And that ought to work without any issues, as long as you don't keep the soldering iron there too quick. So you can use some flux, good solder. I recommend 6337 solder, and it ought to work. I mean, I didn't have any major issues soldering on my XD30 on this board here, and then I removed the that board came with the battery lead already soldered on, so I was able to remove it and put on another battery lead without any issues. But besides that, if your board does come with the battery lead already soldered on, then there is really no soldering to do if you are replacing this for your Mobula 6, because you just unplug the motors, unplug the camera, and you just put the board or swap the board in. So you're only going to run into trouble when you're doing this soldering on this guy, if you're doing a receiver. If you're going to be using something on T2R2 and not using smart audio, you could do that. So that's another question I got from a lot of people, is if you wanted to use UR2, you would have to disable smart audio on the video transmitter. It'll just stay in whatever power and channel setting that you left it on previously. But then obviously there's no button on here to change your bands and channels and all that for the video transmitter. So you're dependent on smart audio. As long as you know you're not going to be changing your channel, you could use the second UART for something else, like say GPS or some other external peripheral if you desire to do that. Another question they had was regarding the ESCs in here. They are the H style ESC, so they will work with Jazz Maverick RPM filter firmware as well as the JESC firmware. Of course, if you want to use anything other than 40 kHz firmware, you will have to get the licensing for that one. But if you want to go the freeware, the Jazz Maverick firmware will work on this board as well. And I actually have RPM filter working on the baby tooth over here, so that you've already seen that already in the previous video. But anyway, so overall, it is a pretty amazing board, for what you get. It's very light. You get a lot of functions integrated into a single board. If you're going for those really stupid light builds, this kind of is your only viable solution out there. No one else makes a board this light with all of those features built in the board. The only caveat that you have to be aware of is that you have to be very careful on how you handle this, because they didn't design this board for custom builds. This was designed specifically for the Mobula 6. So that is something that you're going to have to keep in mind regarding how you use this, and you have to be very careful in the way you handle it and the way you do the soldering, because because the board's so thin and there's nowhere for the heat to go, you will start lifting pads and damaging the board if you are not very good with soldering and keep them on the board for too long. So be aware of that. And then the last thing is, you can probably replace the SPI receiver antenna with the extended antenna that I modded previously. I'll show you that in a later video. That's probably not that difficult to get that working. So that's another question. This one here, the black one, is the receiver antenna, and then the copper antenna is the video transmitter antenna. So if you're having issues with this either breaking off in crashes, or you want to replace this, you're not getting good reception, for example, you can replace this. And you can see here that the ground pads for the video transmitter antenna are available here. And that's the signal pad right there for the antenna. So you could replace this antenna with one that has the ground, or maybe even if you want to put a micro FL connector on here. I'm not sure why you would want to do that for the extra weight. You could direct solder your antenna with the ground element and extend the antenna out past the canopy and the camera. If you were looking to get better video transmission, you could do that as well. Yeah, but people were wondering if this was for video. This is definitely for video, and this have the ground pads here. This one here is for the receiver, but the ground pad here, I think, if I remember right, I tested one of these capacitors. One of these on the side here is negative, so you could possibly use that for the extended antenna mod, and I will show you that in a later video. Okay, one more last thing you guys should be aware of is that apparently someone has discovered that you can run the video transmitter past 25 milliwatts. And I think it goes up to 200 or 350 or something ridiculous. Highly recommend you don't do that unless you are blowing air over this board, because you will fry the board. It will get at 25 milliwatts. It gets hot as it is. So I can't imagine how it's going to get if you're throwing extra power through this. Yeah, so I've heard people doing that, but then, remember this, if you're throwing that much power through this board, and it's not really designed for it, it's designed for 25 milliwatts, and you're throwing 200 milliwatts of power through this, I would not expect the board to last that long if it's running super hot all the time. It might be okay to do it occasionally, but again, it's not designed for it, so be aware that if you're running it out of spec and you kill it, that's probably the reason why. So also, when you're plugging this in to USB, it powers everything, the ESCs, the flight controller, the video transmitter, the whole works, which is not that, it's a design flaw in my opinion. They should not be powering the video transmitter. and even on USB it gets very hot on 25 milliwatts. I actually would recommend put the video transmitter into pit mode while you're setting it up. That's the first thing that I would do. So when you set up your board here for the first time, plug it in, put the video transmitter into pit mode, and then do all your setup, because while it's plugged in on your bench, unless you have air flowing over it, it's going to get very hot very quickly. So yeah, just be aware of that. And until the board, like, what happens is the board gets really hot, you get the core temperature warnings on the flight controller, and sometimes it'll shut down or just do some kind of weird stuff. That's the reason why, because it's running too hot. So if you're getting some weird behavior, it's because it's running too hot. If you need time to set it up and you're not in pit mode, then at least have a fan blowing some air over it. Okay, so I think that's it for this guy. Yeah, I personally like this board a lot. I actually have about 7 or 8 of these now, and all of them are working. I haven't killed any of them yet, but you know, I'm pretty careful with the. I've been pretty careful with the way I've been handling the board. So yeah, so far so good. Keep my fingers crossed. But yeah, if you're doing these normal builds and not running this on 2S or 3S like some people have seen do, it's a 1S board, not a 3S board. Yeah, if you run 3S in this, it'll probably smoke. So yeah, you're wondering why that happened. Don't run 3S on this or 2S. So yeah, anyway, if you're doing the normal things on this it's supposed to do within the specs, then it will probably be okay. But if you're not, then expect smoke or bad things to happen. Anyway, just wanted to talk about this board and answer all the questions I've gotten about it and what you can and can't do with it. So hopefully that's answered all your questions. If you got any more, let me know in the comments below, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one.